Hello there, and welcome to today's episode of the Canadian Philosophy Show. I'm Hale Rothery, and today with me is Michael Caditz, and we are going to be talking about Marshal McLuhan's idea of the medium is the message, and we'll get into what that means shortly. But we'll also be looking through it, particularly through a 1985 work by Neil Postman, a kind of pupil, in a way, of McLuhan's, entitled Amusing Ourselves to Death, um, which will look particularly at the idea of the medium and the message and how different mediums affect public discourse and culture. So this is a very pertinent topic for today. We live in a media world, and every media that we're surrounded by is essentially a different medium. I think we'll get into a little bit about what that all is. But I think most of us pervade through the world in a way in which we are just familiar with the mediums that we use every day. And to kind of get into that a little bit, into what I mean, and then we can pop into a little more of the nuanced conversation. We're really looking here, when we talk about the medium as the message, we're talking about the difference between form and content. Or, put another way, the information conveyed and how the information is conveyed. So, let's say we have just a small piece of information. Let's take something really, really simple. There are a message, let's say, that says to you, there are 3 sides to a triangle. Depending on the form, that's the content of the message, but there are all sorts of different forms in which that message can be conveyed. So it can be conveyed through conversation. It can be conveyed over the radio, like you're perhaps listening right now. It can be conveyed visually. It can be conveyed typographically, right? It could be like a written sentence. And the implication for all those is that, while it seems like the information is the same, there's a way in which each medium has a slight deviation on what is actually being conveyed. Each form, in a sense, manipulates the content, and to extend that, each form also privileges a certain kind of content, right? So each form is better for conveying certain kinds of messages or styles of messages than others, and then the outgrowth of this is that forms or mediums that are more or less prevalent in a particular culture or historical period or society, or even depending on how ourselves as individuals operate, has a great impact on what a society will discuss, how it will discuss it, how it will think, and basically what it'll all be about. So I know that sounds kind of a little bit abstract, a little bit convoluted, but I think we're going to get into some more concrete examples. I know, Mikey, that this is something that you've looked at before, so is there anything that you'd like to add or kind of jump off from there?
I think you hit the nail on the head, Hale, when you pointed out there's a distinction between content and the delivery medium. And the important point here then is going to be that the medium influences the way the message is received. So that's where I think Marshal McLuhan's phrase, the medium is the message, comes from. And actually, the McLuhan's phrase is even stronger than what I said. He actually said that the medium is the message, which implies that that the delivery medium may even be, or is even more important or more influential in the message that's received than the actual content.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case, and that's a like that's been a debate for a long time as to whether or not the information, the form is more important than the actual message received. But I absolutely think that is what McLuhan is arguing, and it's interesting that you bring that up because Postman, who like we said was essentially a pupil of McLuhan, actually changes the saying a little bit, and he says the medium is the metaphor. So, okay, sounds a little bit more convoluted. What's going on there? The reason Postman makes that change is to emphasize the fact that any kind of society or culture that we live in is a society of symbols. We never interact with the thing in itself. We could have a whole other big conversation, philosophical conversation of whether or not that's the case, but this is Postman, and I think largely McLuhan's premise as well. We never interact with the thing itself. We always interact with stuff through something, through some medium. And those mediums are always coloring our worlds. They are always coloring what we interact with, what we see, how we understand it, how we think. And in a sense, the mediums create a metaphorical society. To kind of illustrate that, think about how we talk about historical ages. We talk about the Bronze Age. We talk about the Industrial Age. We talk about the Digital Age, right? Why do we speak like that? I believe, and Postman believes, is because on some implicit level, we know that certain mediums, whether they be mediums of metallurgy, mediums of industrial advancement and technological production, mediums of digital communication, those mediums have an extensive effect on the kind of world that we live in, and what our frames of reference are, what our abilities to understand are. And this is hugely, hugely important. And to both McLuhan and Postman's point as well, these forms exclude certain content, and I think we'll get into that a little bit.
So do you see a distinction then between Postman and McLuhan's thesis? Do you see them as being in disagreement with each other, Hale?
I think that they are very, very similar. And to illustrate a little bit more about what Postman's argument really is, I'm gonna read a very brief passage from his actual work in which he says, where he actually outlines his argument. He says, my argument is that, he says, it is an argument that fixes its attention on the forms of human conversation and postulates that how we are obliged to conduct such conversations will have the strongest possible influence on what ideas we can conveniently express. And what ideas are convenient to express inevitably become the important content of a culture. So really, I think the big distinction between Postman and McLuhan is that in some ways Postman is a little broader, talking about the medium as a metaphorical creation, but in other ways Postman is a little more pointed and a little more focused because he's particularly concerned with political discourse. He's particularly concerned with the fact that technology, and to be frank, his book's from the 80s. It's about television, but a lot of it I think, transplants well to modern social media, smartphone technology as well. That there are aspects of political discourse that are heavily favored towards what he calls the typographic medium and the ensuing typographic mind. So basically, to put it simply, the written and printed word, wherein one can elucidate long-form, heavily structured arguments and examinations that are abstract. By its very nature, typography is abstracted, right? One has to read what's going on and then conjure that stuff up in their own mind and understand it and interpret it. And Postman's argument, and I think this is where he kind of goes beyond McLuhan, is that this is a more complicated and difficult and frankly, a lot of times a boring process. But it yields a much richer level of information on any given subject. And we are now with a lot of with television, and I think particularly moving into sort of the digital social media community, we now live in an image culture. And I don't think that's a particularly controversial thing to say, but what I mean by that is we've moved essentially from the eye of the mind being the focus of how we understand information to literally the visual eye, and what catches our attention as quick, as entertaining, as quote unquote beautiful or funny, or however you might want to dispense it. And that kind of medium is not conducive to complex political discourse. And so I think that's the essential, or one of it, I would actually say probably the essential point of Postman that kind of goes beyond McLuhan, is that we are losing an ability to have a complicated, politically discursive society. And we can get into a little bit about what that actually looks like for him as well.
I think a question is, what is the purpose of the media? What is the goal of television productions, including maybe especially news productions? Now, maybe the market is different in different countries in different parts of the world. The U.S. market is slightly different than the Canadian market, but in general, in a profit-driven media world, a ratings-driven media world, where where advertisers are the ones that fund the broadcasters and the media outlets, it seems like the underlying premise is that in order to succeed, a media outlet needs to be profitable. In order to be profitable, they need to get as many viewers as possible. They need to get their share, right? Their share of the market as measured by Nielsen ratings and other ratings companies. And if they don't get enough viewership, they won't get advertising money, and they won't survive. I think that's in general the rule. Now, there's some exceptions when there's publicly funded broadcasters and so on, although they've been having hard times with being defunded and reduced funding and that kind of thing, and also political opposition from like in the United States, from the right wing, political opposition to public funding of broadcasters. But to the extent that the media exist in a competitive marketplace, there seems to be a structural conflict between, on one hand, the idea of making a profit, on the other hand, the idea of delivering news that's accurate and complex, as the world is complex. So I'm wondering what our authors, McLuhan and Postman, say about that. The problem of the profit motive being in tension with or in opposition to the idea of responsibility to truth and accuracy, and not just truth and accuracy, but to comprehensive coverage of events.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought this up, Mike, because this is an essential discussion for both of them, and particularly for Postman. You brought up the news, and just so everyone is aware, like, there was a lot of fear mongering both when Postman wrote his book in the 80s and up until now about everything from TV to digital media, like the smartphone, let's say, or like your laptop, your social media, kind of stuff, that that it's evil, that it destroys quality, that's good, all this kind of stuff. And this actually isn't, particularly for Postman, and I think for McLuhan as well, this really isn't their argument. That's not really their concern. For Postman in particular, his concern is that it's certain kinds of things. He even says that, like, the best thing about TV is the trash on TV. It's the crappy shows, it's the funny shows, it's the traditionally entertaining stuff. He's like, he kind of states, is that I've got no problem with that. What he has a problem with is turning what was formerly, as we turn what was formerly a complex dialogue, generally done through either in an actual vocal dialogue or done through the written word, through typography, as we try and translate that onto the television, onto the smartphone, onto your Instagram, they have to turn from pieces of conveying truth as their primary function, usually using complex arguments, to pieces that are entertaining as their primary function. And the reason is because those mediums that we were just discussing do not handle, essentially, non-entertaining stuff well. You talked about the kind of capitalist logic in the background that, if you don't have viewers, then your network or your streaming service or whatever it is not going to survive. Well, how do you keep viewers? You keep what is on the screen entertaining. If it stays entertaining, then people are going to be entertained and they're going to keep watching. And you're going to garner more viewers, and you're going to have more eyes, and it's going to be more money for you. And we're also such networks and streaming service and all that kind of stuff. They're in luck because those mediums are also geared, being mainly of imagery, are geared to entertaining pieces. To illustrate that fact, both McLuhan and Postman rely on some great sort of analogies. And if we think about this, if we turn on our Netflix, everything that we will find on there is designed or geared or pushed to be entertaining in some way. Some are more successful than others, but we can even think about news medium. If I turn on my CNN, it's not just like some boring background desk where some average-looking person is reading me facts about the day. If any of you have ever gone on YouTube and watched Soviet-era news stations from the Soviet Union or other communist countries, that's actually kind of what they look like, funny enough. But no, it's full of infographics and animations, and the people on there are airbrushed and beautiful and exciting and well-spoken and interesting and well-dressed. And it's engaging to watch CNN. I don't personally want to spend too much on doing it myself, but I can't deny that it's a well-done, essentially entertaining show. Now imagine if there was a different show in which it was literally just text of, let's take a difficult and boring book, in many ways, like particular peer reason for those other philosophers on the show. Those listening will know is a very, very large and complicated philosophical tome from the 18th century. That would not translate well to the TV medium. That would not translate well to the smartphone medium. Even if you took it out of typography, how would you turn the critique of pure reason, let's say, into an Instagram post? How would you translate that into a TikTok video, right? It wouldn't work. And even if you did literally do it, no one would watch it because it wouldn't be entertaining, it wouldn't be favored by the medium, and it would just be lost in the sea of stuff that's put on there. And that's kind of the point for both McLuhan and Postman, is that that's the way in which these mediums direct our culture, direct our societies, and even direct our minds, right? Like, people who are using their main source of medium as something like, let's say, TikTok or Instagram, are being excluded from a whole realm of knowledge and discourse and understanding because the medium is not conducive to that stuff. And I don't just mean take a pure reason. I mean stuff like nuanced, long-form political conversation or discussions around pertinent scientific issues or whatever it might be, those things, when you see them, and they are on there, depending on how your feed is set up, in some form, are generally reduced to a fragment. A fragment that is included with exciting visuals as well, but essentially every time. Or if it's going to be popular, it needs to be put into a pithy saying, like on something like Twitter, where you're allowed only 150 characters per post, right? So all these sorts of mediums don't allow for that boring, complex, but in many, I think both of us would agree, and certainly McLuhan and certainly Postman would agree, important stuff for a healthy mind and a healthy culture.
Yeah, I think what comes to the surface here is the underlying question of whether the media is delivering the content that people want, or whether what people want is shaped by the content that the media delivers. So what comes first? The cart or the horse, right? So, I mean, you could argue that that the media is simply responding to the public appetite. The public doesn't want boring news. They don't want complex portrayal of events. They want sound bites. They want simplicity. They want entertainment. In fact, that's why people gravitate toward news broadcasts and television shows that are entertaining. That's what they want. They want to be entertained. They don't want an inventory of events that are happening in the world, especially when those are complex or nuanced. And so one could argue that the media is simply delivering what the public wants. They're meeting the demand. And which is exactly why the ratings of shows that don't deliver what people want will be lower, and they won't get advertisers, and the shows won't continue. So one could argue that that's the free marketplace at work, working just the way it should. But as you pointed out, though the problem is that that may lead to a lack of understanding about what's really happening in the world and what the world is like, because content will be missing because it's not entertaining, and it will be simplified and dumbed down because that's what people have the capability or the capacity to watch. And so you could argue that although media might be successful in being entertaining and whetting the appetite and satisfying the appetite of large numbers of people, it's not actually delivering content which is quality. And it's not quality in the sense that it doesn't accurately reflect the way the world is, and is missing a lot of information that's important from a, let's say, from a social standpoint or from a political standpoint. And then you could also argue the opposite, that that the media actually creates its own market. It actually creates the appetites of people, and then turns around and fulfills the appetite that they created. So if the media portrays the world as very simplistic, and and what's going on in a city is mostly like shootings and automobile accidents and scandals, People magazine type scandals, and then that sort of creates the market as it whets that appetite, and then people develop an expectation that they're going to see more of that, and they're not interested in the complexities because they haven't been educated in the complexities of the world. So I think that's an underlying question: is what comes first, the demand or the product?
Yeah, and I think it's a difficult question to answer. I'm trying to think about how to, and I like your last point. I think from my reading of McLuhan and my reading of Postman, the most important point is that the certain mediums used, as you pointed out, by the media, they are in a sense creative of the space in which they are most successful. And so what I mean by that is that there's perhaps a generative time where it takes a while for a certain medium to get their footing. I think about television, and since we've been talking about it, I think more specifically about television news. And we spoke about earlier about, or mentioned, that nobody's going to want to watch news that is like a boring talking head just kind of reading facts. But if you look back at early television news, so we're talking particularly in the 50s and stuff, and you can have discussions about how accurate the facts they were displaying was, but in terms of the content that was formulated by the form, by the medium, that's kind of what it looked like. It was just people, chatting, sitting at a desk and being like, here's what's happening in the world today, blah, 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 for 20 minutes, and that was it. That was your news. And it was really borrowing from a newspaper style medium where you're getting, a whole bunch of different short, informative sum-ups of information throughout the day, and there's really no table dressing around any of it. When Postman was writing in the 80s, his particular concern, as I've already mentioned, was the news, was public discourse, particularly through the news. And the 80s is an interesting, 70s and 80s particularly, and I think starting with kind of Vietnam War, but really gets going in the 1980s, is really the producers, the manufacturers of content on the form catch up to the capabilities and encouragements of the form, of the medium. And so what I mean by that is they realize that you look at that's when the 80s is when big cable news networks came into being. So places like CNN, Fox, and the other classic CNBC and stuff like that. And they recognized that imagery is far, far, far more important than the actual content conveyed on the news show. That it needs, like you mentioned, it's about, like, if we're going to utilize the form, we're going to utilize the medium to its fullest potential, and in a sense let the medium guide us into what our content is going to look like, then it's going to be exciting, it's going to be fast, it's going to be pretty, it's going to be scary, it's going to be entertaining. And that is, I think, the crux of it, and why sometimes it can be confusing, is it takes time sometimes for the content producers to catch up to the capabilities of particular styles of the medium and what the medium is really most accustomed for. So yeah, I think that in today's culture, like, we're really just seeing now the beginnings of digital smartphones, social media mediums really, really coming into their own. I mean, I have a few really brief stats here, but in terms of how those sorts of mediums are changing people's lives, changing people's worlds, changing people's perspectives, as particularly as social media like Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, all this kind of stuff becomes sort of concrete and coalesced in terms of how people understand and actually view themselves in the world. If people have any doubts about this, I was looking up some basic stats, and the average, according to some 2021 research, the average person spends 5 hours, and I should say these are American stats, but the average person spends 5 hours a day on their smartphone in somewhere or another. 3/4 of the American populace owns a modern smartphone. Most people on average check their phone in some form or another 63 times a day, and over 1 in 10 millennials spend more than 12 hours a day attached or using or utilizing the medium of the phone in some way or another. So I really think that we're at the beginning of sort of seeing these the companies behind the mediums in some way really catching up to the incredibly, I think I'll say, pervasive way in which modern, particularly handheld smartphone-like devices and all that the different, it's kind of like the layered mediums that they allow for, really the ability for them to completely recontextualize our world, essentially, our society, and by extension ourselves.
Yeah, and back to Marshall McLuhan and his phrase, "the medium is the message." I think the most basic way to support that assertion is just to point out how people tend to believe things because of the medium on which that information was delivered. So people tend to say, well, I saw it on television, so it must be true. Or it was on the internet. Or it was in the newspaper. And so when people say that, what that suggests is that the medium is the message, because the delivery method lends credibility in many people's minds, not everybody's, many people's minds, to the content. And so I'm thinking about, all the many times I've heard people say, well, it must be so, or I believe it's so because I saw it on the internet. And it was on the TV news. However, I also know that when I see news stories on topics about which I have some expertise, because in my life I've been involved in a particular hobby or pursuit or done research, I often notice inaccuracies and mistakes in news reports. So I think about how someone who didn't know much about a particular topic and relied upon a news report because it was on the news would have the wrong impression or would have misinformation. So I think that illustrates McLuhan's point, which is that part of the product that the mass media delivers is the air of credibility, right? They want to appear to be credible, but a critical thinker would still have to assess the content separate from the delivery method and make a critical judgment about how much weight to give that content. Now, I'm not saying that somebody should disbelieve everything the media says, because there's a lot of true and important things that are delivered by news outlets. But the point would be to analyze what one hears and sees and reads with a critical eye, critical ear, and use critical thinking skills. And look at what the source is, not just the delivery method. Where does who's the source of that information? And sometimes it's difficult, right? Sometimes it's difficult to use critical thinking skills and sort out the fact from the fiction, or the slanted, or the colored or inaccurate information. It can be very, very difficult, but this is where critical thinking skills can come into play when assessing content delivered by ostensibly credible media outlets.
Yeah, and Mike, I really like that you brought that up, and that leads, when you talk about people taking at face value, essentially, there's the implicit notion, let's say news media, and this was true for a long time, that because it's on the news, it's true, right? So we'll just take that, and that's the implicit sort of message of that medium, right? Is if it's, and that was for I think the case for a lot of people for a long time was, if I see it on TV, something about the form of the content of stuff being on TV is that it's implicitly true. And I think we're seeing a very interesting shift, particularly with young people. I think about my younger siblings and stuff like that who are late teens, and others 20, wherein there is a receding from that notion that because it's on the TV or because it comes from mass media, at least a clearly defined mass media, and I'll get into that in a second, that the medium basically can't be trusted, right? We hear, we've heard a lot of talk about like mainstream media in the past, and I think part of that is fueled by the newer medium, the digital medium, particularly the medium of smartphones, and particularly the medium of the particular apps, i.e. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, the likes of those, in that what they appear to do is diffuse truth and content creation. And what I mean by that is that you're no longer tuning into CNN, you're no longer tuning into Fox and some big network, which is a media of one to many, right? You've got this network and they broadcast out a message to many people. We now see in these news sources or social media mediums a more of an interplay or the possibility of the interaction being still one to many, but also many to one, many different people being able to contact and interact with one content creator, or many to many, right? Large discursive forums, for example, where many people discuss a topic and many people claim to be experts. But most importantly, I think, is the notion of the content creator or the influencer. And this seemingly independent and quote unquote free speaker of truth is becoming far more trusted as a relayer of information than the news media, at least for young people. And that's the nature of the form or the medium that they're on, right? That encourages this diffusion of the spreading of information amongst people who are seemingly like individuals, right? And because they're apparently not attached to any big corporation or big entity, they are somehow more objective, right? They are somehow less tainted, and that they actually give the real information. And that's how a lot of people understand, know about the world, like watching vloggers and people like that, whether it be on YouTube or Instagram or whatever, TikTok, right? Talking about current social issues. If you go on any of those sites, you'll see millions of videos. The big lie, though, is that all those people are still wed to the systems of corporation, but instead of news media, it's big tech, right? And they've organized the medium in such a way in which these new essentially information entertainers are garnering views in the same way, garnering views and users and profiles in the same way that or in an analogous way at least, that news media sought out 20, 30, 40 years ago in its move to an entertainment base. And as you said, like at the end of the day, all these people really don't have any like direct line to the truth of what they're talking about, more so than a news network or anything. They just it's just the form looks different. And in a sense, it feels different, and it makes us think differently. It makes us feel that we have more of a personal relationship with who we're watching, who we're following, and that therefore somehow there's an emotive element in which it makes it feel more real and more authentic and more true. But I personally think that is not actually anything objective. That's just a nature of the form. The nature of the medium.
Right, and to follow up on my point from earlier, I think it's important to clarify something, which is that the approach that I try and take to The media is that of a critical thinker, which means that on one extreme, I don't believe everything literally that I see on the media merely because it's media. And on the other extreme, I don't reject things that are likely or obviously true merely because they're on media, and I don't trust media. So this is important because it's applicable today. It's relevant today. There's two sides of a coin, and it's a flawed coin. One side of the coin is to believe everything you hear and read without question, merely because it's in print or it's on television. And the other side of that same flawed coin is to reject things because they're in the media, or reject things that out of hand, even though things might be obviously true, and then blame it on the misinformation of the media. So I'll give a couple examples. So when George Bush wanted to build a case to invade Iraq, when Saddam Hussein was the leader of Iraq, Bush and the U.S. government promoted the false narrative that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. And that was justification for invading Iraq. Well, that turned out to be false, but to a great extent, that lie was promoted in and by the American and world media. And so people that were relying on the media and uncritically believed what the media told them, believed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Indeed, there were many polls which showed a vast majority of people, of Americans, believed that, because that's what they read and heard in the media. Republicans even more than Democrats, but even Democrats. So that's an example of people believing something because it's promoted in the media. That's what McLuhan's point was. The medium is the message. The medium lended credibility to what was false content. Another example today would be that there's a correlation between Fox News viewers in the United States and those that believe, largely Republicans, that believe that the last presidential election was stolen from Trump, that there was massive voter fraud. Well, there's little or no evidence of any kind of large-scale voter fraud, and yet at least 2/3 of Republicans believe that there was. And it correlates with information source, such as Fox News in particular. So the medium is the message, right? On the other hand, on the other side of that flawed coin, we have people that deny obvious truths, such as the existence of a pandemic, or the dangers of the virus. Of the COVID virus. They deny that there's really a problem, there's really a pandemic. They deny that there's hundreds of thousands of people that have died. They deny that that there's people in the hospital suffering. And they say, well, the media is just lying. You can't believe what you see in the media. You can't believe the reports that are plastered all over, CNN and everywhere. And they deny all the interviews with doctors and scientists and epidemiologists. So a critical thinker would not accept or reject something because it's information carried by the media. A critical thinker wouldn't reject it nor accept it merely because they saw a news report. A critical thinker would consider what he or she reads or sees in the news and on television as evidence, but not conclusive evidence, and would take into account the sources, the preponderance of the evidence, and so on. So the preponderance of the evidence right now is that there is a pandemic, that many, many people are suffering and have died because of COVID, and COVID continues to pose a threat. And the evidence is overwhelming that the vaccine is much more beneficial than it is threatening or harmful. That's what I believe a critical thinker would arrive at, regardless of what the media says one way or the other. So, you get my point, Hale, that that what we read and see in the media is evidence, but we have to look at the source, the preponderance of the evidence, and not either accept or reject something merely because we saw it on TV.
I 100% agree with that point. And thinking to a little bit towards Postman and McLuhan, I would say that kind of an interesting way of highlighting the point that if let's take our critical thinker, and let's say our critical thinker has been inundated with these two points of view that some you need to understand. Let's say that our critical thinker is being faced with something that they see in the media, and they want to know if they can understand it. Let's say they watched it on TV or they saw it on the CNN YouTube channel or whatever it might be, some form of, for the sake of argument, some form of image media, some form of digital or television image media. How would they go about understanding or getting a clear grasp on what the actual truth is, right? How would they, facilitate some critical thinking about the issue? Well, I think most people would agree that they would go and do research. How would they go and do research? Would they watch more news media? Would they go on Instagram and look at some different content creators and what they have to say? Or would they go to the general source of information? That tends to be typographic because it tends to be nuanced, it tends to be long form, it tends to be argumentative, and it tends to be complex. And I think that illustrates the difference in the medium there between image media and typographic media or mediums, in that the latter is more preferential to truth and is more preferential to complex information that often holds truth. If you really want to know about what's going on in the pandemic, you go and read we're in BC, and I have read bits and pieces before. Every week, the BC government releases a long-form COVID data package, which is typographic. And to be frank, I'm not really well versed on biology and epidemiology, so I don't really know a lot of what they're talking about in there. But the point is that it is a typographic complex document that lays out real information that gives one a real view, or a much clearer view, but a more abstracted view, in a sense, of what is actually going on in the pandemic in the region of British Columbia. So I think that is in relation to both Postman and McLuhan highlighting that there is perhaps something to be said for certain mediums being better vehicles for truth and knowledge than others.
Yeah, thank you. I also wanted to save a few minutes here to bring in my own perspective. This is slightly different than McLuhan or Postman, I believe. It's sort of a different perspective on what we can learn from media, from mass media. So if you're willing, I just wanted to share it with you. We can...
Absolutely.
Yeah, I believe that we can learn... Well, let me backtrack. Not only does media shape society, as we've offered all kinds of evidence for it today, Hale, and certainly McLuhan and Postman agree with that. Not only does media shape society and influence society and influence attitudes by the content and the delivery method of information and what it selects to deliver or not, in part driven by the profit motive and the need to keep the ratings high. But also we can learn something about society. This is sort of the reverse. We can learn about society from the media and the way that journalists write. And so it's a whole nother involved topic, but I just want to give two examples. And this is my thesis, right? And I have one of my theses about society now is that people are very careful not to accuse somebody of wrongdoing unjustly. There's a value right now, a value in society to be very careful about unjustly accusing somebody of a crime, and that's why we see a lot of language like allegedly, how the media, and for, as long as I can remember, the media is usually very careful to, if someone's been accused of a crime, to say somebody allegedly, or the alleged culprit, right? The alleged perpetrator, and they do that because of the legal principle that someone is innocent until proven guilty. So we can see a reflection of that principle in the language that journalists use when they use the word allegedly, rather than someone definitively committed a crime but is alleged to have committed a crime. So we all know about that. But it's even more nuanced than that, because there's another word that I've found is very common these days in journalism, which is the word potentially. And I believe that it's overused to the point of redundancy. Here's one example. It's actually a quote in a CBC news story on the Meng Zhao case. The CBC quoted the lawyers for Meng. They said, "This new evidence consists of indisputably reliable contemporaneous business records from the purported victim HSBC that are capable of potentially demonstrating that the narratives presented by the U.S. are so defective as to compel the court to place no reliance on them." So I want to focus on this phrase. The journalist didn't write it, to be sure, but the quote was given to the journalist. This phrase, that are capable of potentially demonstrating that the narratives presented by the U.S. So what's the point of the word potentially? I believe it's redundant, because capable is already conditional. Capable just means, if I'm capable of climbing a mountain, it doesn't mean I'm actually going to climb the mountain. It just means that I theoretically could. I'm capable of it. So here are some business records that are capable of demonstrating XYZ. So if the claim is that they're capable of demonstrating, why do you have to put in the word potentially? It's redundant, in my view. So this is just an example of what's really common, I think, in journalism today, is this word potentially, to try and distance oneself and be non-committal to the claim. So that's my thesis, that journalists, or those that are giving quotes to journalists, are afraid to commit fully to a claim, and so they stick the word potentially in there so they can have like an out. And so my thesis, this is my theory, Hale, is that there's a phenomenon now in society where people are afraid to commit to their views. They're afraid to commit to controversial positions, and that's sort of related to the being afraid to accuse somebody. People want to give themselves an out or two because they're afraid of consequences, and so that's a theory that I have, and I think I want to do a show on that. That word potentially is used as a wiggle word quite a bit, to the point of redundancy. And then another example that I have where media reflects societal phenomena and societal attitudes, it's back to this allegedly thing. So this was an article, the front page of the CNN website on, let's see if I have the date here. July 25th, 2021, one of the headlines for an article is, "Two charged with allegedly hitting police horse during anti-lockdown protest." Well, it makes sense to use the word allegedly when you say that that Jones allegedly hit Brown, right? Because it's only an allegation. But when someone's charged with something, we all know that being charged with something is not equivalent to being convicted. Charge merely is just a charge is laid, right? You're accused of something. You're not accused of allegedly doing something. You're accused of doing it. But journalists are so afraid, this is my theory, afraid to wrongly accuse somebody. They're walking on eggshells and afraid to be blamed for wrongly accusing somebody, that they stick in an extra word, allegedly, even when it's not necessary. The headline of the story should be, in my view, simply, "Two charged with hitting police horse." There's nothing in that is unjust, or is that unjustly saying someone did something. You're just saying that somebody was charged with something. But when you stick in the word allegedly, as this journalist did, whoever wrote this, I think it reflects a fear that's prevalent in society now and reflected in the media, the fear of getting in trouble for committing to a position and saying something directly. So rather than the simple statement, the obvious statement, which is not at all unjustly attributing a crime to somebody, it should just say "two charged with hitting police horse." But to say "two charged with allegedly hitting police horse" is actually incorrect, because whoever those two people are weren't charged with allegedly hitting a police horse. They were simply charged with hitting a police horse. So all of that, Hale, is part of a theory that I'm working on, that I think I'll do a show on, which suggests that the media, if we look carefully at what's written in the media, we actually see a reflection of societal phenomena. So the media is very valuable in discovering what society's like, just as much as we can say that the way society is because of the way the media portrays things.
I want to jump in. I really like what you were saying there, and I tend to agree in the context of how the media is sort of elucidating our fears of being accused for wrong ways in which we may have perceived of accusing others. But I want to, when I think, as you were talking, Mike, I was thinking about Postman, and I was thinking particularly about McLuhan, and I was thinking particularly about McLuhan's idea of the global village, and I was thinking, I agree with you. I think there's a legal side to why people are so concerned, and I think that actually has to do with the medium as well. But I also think there's something inherent in the nature of the medium of what's going on there. So McLuhan's idea of the global village was that, electronic technology is essentially it's exactly what you would think from that global village. The world is no longer fragmented into communal hamlets. It's becoming one global state, and everyone is connected. And that means that far more people have the ability to see and understand and evaluate what you do. And so, on a legal sense, you're much more open to both legal courts and the court of public opinion, which is perhaps even more pervasive. But so I think that's absolutely true. I also think within the content, or within the structure of the media, I think that particularly modern digital internet medium, like we've talked about before, like your Facebooks, your Instagrams, social media in particular, what it encourages is to have status, to have cultural clout in those mediums, as a user of those mediums. One needs to take a stand on a variety of issues. The problem arises, though, that those mediums also encourage a hyper diversification and showing of issues. Basically, what I'm saying in a complicated sentence is your thread, your feed is full of all sorts of stuff. people being concerned with all sorts of different global, political, social issues. And you are impelled to take some kind of stand as a user. However, you don't want to take too much of a stand. You don't want to be, and so you use not totally committal absolutist language a lot of the time, because things are so apt to change. The information that is displayed through these mediums is so fragmented and so simplified that opinions about issues, particular issues, change so rapidly, and you don't want to get caught on the wrong side of the aisle. So if you're always kind of committing but never fully committing, then it makes your transition. It makes you a more viable, basically mover and user in and more capable user in these modern media. But as we come to the end of that discussion, I look forward to as we come to the end of this discussion, and I look forward to our future discussion that Mikey elucidated a bit. I recognize that it's about time for us to go. So thanks for tuning in to the Canadian Philosophy Show. It's been great. I've really enjoyed it, Mikey, and we'll see you all next time. Bye.